Something just shattered behind closed doors at Windsor Castle, and palace watchers are calling it the most terrifying royal moment in living memory. A king dropped to his knees in front of his daughter-in-law and begged for mercy. A queen consort was brutally forced out of her own home in the dead of night, and the person who made every single bit of it happen was Princess Anne, the late queen's most trusted daughter, the most feared woman in that family. Camilla never saw it coming. The British public was never told a word. What happened next is far darker than any of this. Before we get to everything that unfolded that dangerous night, we need to talk about what Camilla actually did, what she did that was so devastating that it got her thrown out of Clarence House in the dead of night, because none of what happened to her was random. Every single thing that came for her, she built herself, brick by brick, decision by decision, over decades. The first thing you need to understand is that Camilla had spent her entire royal career surviving by one method. She would find someone to destroy, leak damaging and poisonous stories about that person to the press, and then sit back safely while that person burned. She had done it her whole life. She was extraordinarily good at it, and for years it worked perfectly. What multiple royal insiders have alleged is that she did not stop doing it when she became queen consort. She kept going, and the target she chose next was the one that finally cost her everything. When Meghan Markle entered the picture and the tabloid machine was hungry for a villain, sources close to palace operations allege that a senior aide directly connected to Camilla's office became the primary source feeding damaging stories about Meghan to the press. Specific stories designed to destroy Meghan's credibility before she could build any real footing inside the institution. And the most devastating story of all was this. In the days leading up to Meghan and Harry's royal wedding in 2018, there was a tense disagreement between Meghan and Kate over the flower girl dresses for Princess Charlotte. According to sources, Kate was so harsh during that exchange that Meghan was the one who left the room in tears. But sources claim it was Camilla who buried that truth completely, planting the reverse story in the press that it was actually Meghan who made Kate cry. That single story burned Meghan's reputation in one news cycle. Princess Anne had watched Camilla operate the tabloid machine for 30 years. She had seen this pattern play out over and over again. She knew who always survived in this family, and she knew who always burned. And she filed every single detail of what she witnessed. But that was only the beginning of what Camilla did. Because the second offense is the one that shattered whatever remained of Anne's tolerance for her permanently. This one happened inside the palace walls in the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life. In those final months, when the Queen was visibly declining, when the entire palace staff was quietly preparing for the end, Camilla was making calls. She was lobbying for expanded ceremonial roles. She was positioning herself for a power upgrade, not privately and not carefully. Openly enough that multiple palace staff members witnessed it and later reported it. She was building her future while the woman above her was still breathing, still fighting, still wearing the crown. One palace insider described it in words that nobody who heard them has ever forgotten. He said, "Vultures were circling while the Queen was still warm. That is what it looked like from inside those walls." And Princess Anne was inside those walls, and saw every single moment of it. Anne, who has sacrificed more than the public will ever know to protect the crown her mother carried, watched Camilla maneuver around a dying woman and stored every detail of it. But even that was not the thing that finally triggered the moment where she was sent out of the house. William has been watching Camilla, too. When he began restructuring the royal household's operations, driven in part by his father's declining health and the need to prepare the institution for the future, his team conducted a detailed audit of how the monarchy's charitable and institutional funds were being allocated. What they found inside the Duchy of Cornwall accounts was the detail that stopped everyone cold. Camilla had allegedly been redirecting significant duchy charitable funding toward causes tied directly to her own patronage network, not occasionally, consistently. Quietly. Building what amounted to a private financial empire inside the monarchy's own charitable infrastructure, using the institution's money and the institution's name to expand her personal sphere of influence. That was the moment William stopped watching and started building the plan to remove her. And he worked with Anne. They gathered all the evidence, and walked straight to Camilla, dropped the file on the table in front of her, looked her dead in the eye, and told her directly that she was no longer welcome and that her time was done. And Camilla, the woman who had clawed her way from mistress to queen consort through sheer relentless endurance, had nothing to say back. For the first time in her entire royal career, every tool she had ever used to survive was completely useless to her, and was not there to negotiate. She was not there to warn. She was there to finish something. And Camilla knew it. But to understand why Anne was the one chosen to deliver that moment, you need to understand who Anne really is and what she was truly carrying when she walked through that door. Princess Anne does not act without reason. That is the first thing you need to understand about her. She has spent decades inside the British monarchy as the hardest-working royal in the entire family, the one the late Queen leaned on more heavily than anyone else when things got difficult. She has never courted the press, never needed public approval, never made a single move for the cameras or the headlines. She does her work, she protects the institution, and she stays out of the noise, which is precisely what makes her the most dangerous person in that entire family when she finally decides to act. And she had been deciding for a very long time. 4 years, and had been watching Camilla the way only someone who truly loves an institution can watch someone they believe is slowly hollowing it out from the inside. She watched her mother's legacy get repositioned and reshaped around a woman that Elizabeth had privately never fully accepted, no matter what the official photographs and joint appearances suggested. Because here is what the public does not know. There are persistent claims among palace insiders that in her final years, Queen Elizabeth wept privately over what Camilla's presence had done to the family's image and to the institution she had spent her entire life protecting. Not once, more than once. And was there for those moments. And sat with her mother through them. She watched the woman who had given every single thing she had to the crown, who had sacrificed her privacy and her personal freedom and every ordinary comfort that most human beings take for granted, sit in private devastation over something she could not say publicly and could not fix privately. That grief did not leave, and when her mother died, it became something else, something cold that sat quietly inside her and waited for exactly the right moment with absolute precision. That moment came when William arrived, and understand this clearly. William did not come to Anne as a nephew asking a favor from an aunt. He came as the future king of the United Kingdom with one clear and urgent purpose. He had made the decision that Camilla had to be removed from the heart of the monarchy permanently, and he needed the one person in that family with the moral authority and the iron will to finish it. He came to Anne because Anne was the only person who could walk into that room and make it stick. And before he ever knocked on her door, he had already been working for months to make sure that when Anne did move, Camilla would have nothing left to fight back with. William had been playing chess inside that palace while everyone else was playing checkers. He had been quietly and systematically dismantling Camilla's infrastructure piece by careful piece. Budget allocations that used to run directly through Camilla's office had been frozen. Royal patronages that had expanded significantly under her influence had been reassigned. Correspondence meant for the king was being rerouted through William's team first, giving him full visibility and control over what reached his father and what did not. He had been quietly stripping away her operational power long before a single confrontation took place. When he was finally ready, he brought in Anne, and she delivered. She slapped those files on Camilla's desk and left her totally speechless. But Anne did not act only on her own grief and her own judgment. She had known for years about something hidden deep inside the Windsor archives, a sealed letter written by her mother before she died. And that letter is what transforms this entire story from a family confrontation into something far larger and far more devastating. But before we get to that letter, we need to go back to Windsor Castle on that same night. Because while Anne was delivering the final blow at Clarence House, something else was happening inside the castle simultaneously, something so shocking, so emotionally raw, that the people who witnessed it are still whispering about it weeks later. It all began just after midnight at Windsor Castle, and Catherine arrived completely alone. There was no entourage surrounding her, just her walking into the palace in the dead of night. Waiting for her in a candlelit chamber deep inside the castle was King Charles. And here is the detail that will stop you cold. Charles was wearing absolutely no sovereign insignia, no crown, no robes, no ceremonial dress of any kind, nothing that identifies him as the King of the United Kingdom. That was a deliberate and deeply considered choice. A king who walked into that room as a man first, because what he was about to do required him to leave every symbol of his authority outside that door. What had broken Charles enough to reach this moment was a private report compiled by palace physicians and senior aides. A document that laid out in painful and specific detail exactly what the years of living in Camilla's shadow had done to Catherine. It described the nights Catherine cried herself to sleep while the palace said nothing to protect her. The mornings she covered her swollen eyes with dark glasses and layers of makeup before stepping out to smile for the cameras. The visible and alarming weight she had lost during the darkest periods, her frame shrinking under pressure that the public could see but nobody in the institution would acknowledge. It detailed how the palace had repeatedly allowed the press to treat her as secondary, as less important, less interesting, less worthy of protection than Camilla, the woman who had once been its most hated figure. Catherine had given everything to this institution. She had followed every rule, smiled through every painful moment, and never once complained publicly. And in return, the institution had left her completely exposed while it wrapped Camilla in protection. Charles had read every single word of that report, and it destroyed him because he had not simply witnessed what had been done to Catherine over those years. He had participated in it. He had chosen Camilla's comfort over Catherine's dignity publicly and repeatedly for years. He had enabled it. And now he was sitting alone in a candlelit room with no crown on his head and absolutely nowhere left to hide from what he had done. When Catherine walked through that door, a sitting king of the United Kingdom did something that kings simply do not do. He dropped to one knee in front of his daughter-in-law. Just let that image sit in your mind for a moment because it is almost impossible to fully absorb. And then he pressed a ring into her palm, a plain, quiet ring from Queen Elizabeth's most private and personal possessions, one the Queen had worn during her years of private grief after Prince Philip died. A ring that had never been photographed, never documented publicly, never shown to the press in any form. It was the Queen's private sorrow made into a physical object that could be held and passed on. And Charles took that object, his mother's hidden grief, and he pressed it into Catherine's hand. And then he said 8 words that reportedly brought Catherine to tears. "You are the future I failed to protect." That is a full confession from a man on his knees. Catherine stood there with tears running down her face. But what most of the people in that room did not fully understand was that this moment had not been improvised. It had not been planned by William. It had not been planned by Anne. It had been planned by a woman who had been dead for years and had seen all of this coming long before anyone else in that palace understood what was happening. Because hidden deep inside the Windsor archives was a letter, sealed, private, and it changes every single thing you think you just understood about this story. In the final years of her reign, as her health was declining and she was doing the quiet and painful work of preparing the monarchy for the world that would come after her, Queen Elizabeth wrote a letter and sealed it herself. She hid it inside the Windsor archives where only the most senior and most trusted palace aides would ever find it. A private document containing instructions and truths she apparently did not trust anyone to act on if they knew about them too soon. It was only when William began his restructuring of the royal household that senior palace aides, while going through decades of archive documents deep inside Windsor, stumbled across that sealed letter. And when they broke that seal and read what was inside, everything that had already been set in motion suddenly made complete and terrifying sense. In that letter, the Queen named Catherine as the monarchy's final safeguard. Not Charles, who wore the crown. Not William, who would one day wear it after him. Not Anne, her most fiercely trusted daughter, the woman she had leaned on for decades through the hardest moments of her reign. Catherine, a woman without a single drop of royal blood, a woman who had married into the institution as a young girl from a perfectly ordinary family. Elizabeth, who had given 70 years of her life to keeping the institution alive through wars and scandals and crises that would have destroyed lesser people, had looked at every single person in that family with clear and unsentimental eyes. And she had decided that the one person capable of actually saving the crown was the one who had chosen it freely, not someone who was born into it and had no choice. Someone who had seen it clearly, understood its cost completely, and chosen it anyway, and had paid for that choice in ways the public only partially witnessed. The letter reportedly addressed directly why Elizabeth had chosen Catherine. Elizabeth wrote that Catherine was the only person in the entire family who truly understood that the monarchy's survival in the modern world depends on public trust. And Catherine, through everything she had been put through the press campaigns designed to diminish her, through the years of isolation and being sidelined, had never once broken that trust. She had never secretly briefed a journalist against anyone. She had never fed a damaging story to protect herself. She had never used anyone else as a shield the way Camilla had done her entire life. In a family where that kind of survival tactic had always been considered a necessary tool, Catherine had quietly and consistently refused to pick it up. And Elizabeth had been watching that refusal for years with deep and growing admiration. But the letter did not stop there. It contained something darker, something that transformed it from a statement of confidence in Catherine into something far more urgent. Elizabeth had written a specific and direct warning about Camilla. She wrote that Camilla's continued presence at the very center of the monarchy would eventually become the institution's single most dangerous liability. That the decades of tabloid history, the depth of public resistance that had never truly dissolved no matter how many years passed, the way Camilla had been aggressively accumulating power and financial influence, all of it was pointing unmistakably toward a moment of institutional crisis so severe that the monarchy might not survive it with its credibility intact. Elizabeth had seen this coming. She had written it down in her own hand. She had sealed it and hidden it and trusted one specific person to act on it at the right moment. And that person was Anne. Which means that everything Anne did was never simply a family intervention driven by personal grief. Anne had known about that letter for years. She had been carrying the weight of her mother's final instruction for years, waiting for the moment when William's restructuring had weakened Camilla's position enough that the move could be made cleanly and permanently. And the woman Elizabeth had chosen to carry the monarchy's moral future was sitting alone in the candlelit chamber at Windsor, holding Elizabeth's ring with tears on her face, perhaps wondering whether she was truly ready for the crushing weight of what had just been pressed into her hands. The night removal served two purposes simultaneously, and both need to be stated clearly. The first purpose was punishment. Camilla was not quietly asked to step back through a formal daytime process with dignity and legal representation. She was removed in the dark, with her access revoked, and her identity stripped before she even knew the full scale of what was happening. That was deliberate humiliation. That was the palace making sure she felt every single layer of what was being taken from her. The second, and more powerful, purpose was a message of dominance. By doing it at night, with no press, no official record, and no public explanation, the palace was telling Camilla something very specific. We do not need a public process to destroy you. We do not need cameras or announcements or official procedures. We can take everything from you in complete silence, and there is nothing you can do about it, because as far as the world is concerned, none of this ever happened. That is the most terrifying kind of power, power that does not need to announce itself. By the time the sun came up, Camilla was gone. And the way she left told you everything you needed to know about what had just been done to her. She did not walk out through the main entrance she had used confidently as queen consort for years. She left Clarence House through a side entrance, the narrow, unremarkable entrance used by the staff, the cleaners and the bag carriers and the people who are never in any photograph and never meant to be seen. That was the door they pointed her toward. And if you understand even the basics of how the British monarchy communicates power, you understand without any doubt that was not a logistical decision. That was a message delivered in the most precise and humiliating language the institution had available to it. And the humiliation had started long before she ever reached that door. Her key-card access to palace systems had been revoked before she even got to her car. Her lady-in-waiting, the woman who had served at her side through years of public life, received a formal termination notice that same night. And William, who had been strategically dismantling Camilla's power base for months while everyone else was still watching the surface, had issued a specific instruction to palace communications. Camilla was to be formally classified as a private individual for a minimum of 48 hours. Think hard about what that classification actually meant in real terms. It meant no royal security briefings, no palace legal representation of any kind. It meant no ability to issue a single statement under the royal household name. It meant no institutional identity, no official standing, no mechanism of any kind through which she could respond to what was being done to her. The woman who had spent 30 years of her life fighting ferociously to be recognized as a legitimate member of the British royal family had been reclassified overnight as an ordinary civilian while she was still physically standing inside her own home. What happened next left her even more surprised. Camilla reached for her phone and called her husband. For 2 full days, Charles refused to pick up. The woman he had loved for decades, the woman he had sacrificed so much to stand beside, was calling him from wherever she had gone, and he would not answer. Sources close to palace operations say she spent those 48 hours in complete isolation, no explanation from anyone about what had just happened to her or what came next, just silence from every direction. But here is the thing about that silence that makes it even darker. Palace insiders suggest that Charles was not simply too devastated to speak. He was being held to a condition. William had reportedly made clear to his father that if he broke and contacted Camilla during that window, if he wavered even slightly or tried in any way to soften what had been done, William would move forward with releasing all of their findings directly to the press. Charles was not just sitting in grief. He was cornered. And while Camilla sat completely alone with no calls and no answers and no institutional identity, the palace delivered its final and most devastating statement. Inside the palace's Hall of Matriarchs, the corridor built specifically to honor the women of the monarchy, Camilla's portrait was dragged down from the wall. There was no explanation offered to anyone inside or outside the palace. It was torn from its place in the dead of night and replaced with a portrait of Catherine. Camilla's era was finished. Her face was removed from the wall built to honor her. Now here is what you need to understand clearly before we go any further. This was not a permanent legal removal. Camilla still holds the title of Queen Consort on paper. She will still appear at public events. No law was changed that night and no official announcement was ever made, which was precisely the point. But what was taken from her that night was everything that made that title mean anything at all. It was taken because of what William's audit had uncovered, the deliberate redirecting of Duchy of Cornwall charitable funds into her own patronage network, the financial manipulation of the monarchy's own resources for personal gain. That was the discovery that turned this from a slow institutional push into an immediate and decisive removal. The title stayed. Everything behind it was surgically hollowed out. And in the British monarchy, a title with nothing behind it is not a position. It is a cage. The title of Queen Consort technically still belongs to her on paper, but a title without access, without institutional support, without a husband who answers the phone, without a face on the palace wall, is nothing but a word. And words without power inside the British monarchy mean absolutely nothing at all. Catherine's office is now receiving the royal patronages. Correspondence to the king is now filtered through her team before it reaches anyone else. Senior aides across the palace are now reporting to Catherine, and Princess and has not left Catherine's side in weeks, standing guard over every major decision with the same cold precision she brought to that room at Clarence House, making absolutely certain that nobody moves against Catherine while the transition is still finding its footing. And William is running the entire architecture of this new order from behind the scenes, deliberately invisible, deliberately untouchable, placing his wife at the visible center of the monarchy's moral authority.